All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we have Ashley Whittle, who is the Director of Special Collections and University Archivist at UNC Asheville with us today to give her presentation on The Light at the End of the Tunnel, New Archival Discoveries of the Convict Labor, which built the Western North Carolina Railroad. She did her presentation with us at our conference back in August, and it was very successful and very popular. So we wanted to invite her back to present again, to give everyone an opportunity to hear it if they weren't able to attend in person at the conference, or they were at a different session during the conference and weren't able to listen to her presentation. Ashley has been with UNC Asheville since 2019. Prior to that, she worked in the archives at Biltmore State and as the administrative assistant in the UNC Asheville History Department. She brings a love of regional history and a passion for teaching to the job. Her current research interests include the implementation of convict labor in relation to the building of the Western North Carolina Railroad from Old Fort to Swannanoa. She is a 2016 graduate of the UNCA History Department with her BA in History and also has a minor in Environmental Studies, graduating cum laude. She is a 2022 graduate of UNC Greensboro with her Master's in Library and Information Studies. She teaches as an adjunct for the UNC Asheville History Department. Her classes include Appalachian History, Environmental History, and History of the United States in 1865. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ashley. Please save your questions for the end of the presentation, but if you want, you can put them in the chat. I will be monitoring that throughout the presentation, and we'll let Ashley know what questions you've had throughout the presentation if you put them there. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel, so much. Thanks for inviting me back to do this again. So as Rachel said, good morning. My name is Ashley Whittle. I'm the Director of Special Collections and the University Archivist here at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. This morning's presentation, again, is about the Western North Carolina Railroad. It includes information about the rail project and its work, archival discoveries at the North Carolina State Archives and the Atlanta History Center, and the research that I've been doing as an archivist and a historian on this material. So to start, my interest in this subject matter is both professional and personal. I graduated from UNC Asheville in 2016 with my bachelor's degree in history. While I was here, I mentored under one of the foremost Appalachian historians and scholars in our time, Dr. Daniel Pierce. After I graduated, I went to work at Biltmore State, the Museum Services Department. I returned here to UNC Asheville as the administrative assistant for the history department, and then came in here as the assistant archivist from 2019 to 2024. I became the new director of the archives at the beginning of this year, and in 2022, I got my MLIS from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So my personal experience with this project is real multifaceted. To start, I was a Norfolk Southern family member. My grandfather, Paul Brigman, was a conductor for them for almost 30 years before he retired. I was born and raised in Old Fort. I'm quite obviously an Appalachian historian. I came into this work when Dr. Pierce approached me about being part of a project to memorialize the mountain division of the Western North Carolina Railroad that runs from Old Fort up to Ridgecrest. So the motivation behind that project was that the construction of the mountain division of the Western North Carolina Railroad was widely considered one of the most significant engineering and construction accomplishments of the time. Yet most people are unaware of the human cost the railroad exacted. Lots of folks know the railroad provided the first dependable access to and from much of Western North Carolina for the rest of the state, as well as much of the nation. Many also know that the popular names of some of the men who were instrumental in completing this ambitious project were Colonel Alexander Boyd Andrews of Old Fort Andrews Geyser fame, engineer J.W. Wilson, who was credited with designing the mountain division. You can't leave out Governor Zebulon B. Vance, who pushed through the legislation authorizing the railroad. Most people, though, are unaware that at least 95% of the actual labor that built the railroad across the Blue Ridge Escarpment was completed by inmates from the North Carolina State Penitentiary. Approximately 98% of those inmates were African American men, and the majority of those were unjustly imprisoned. So today I'm going to talk about what has been uncovered in the archives regarding this history, where we go from here with all of this information. So as both a historian and an archivist, my job is not to just help folks find sources for their research, but also to evaluate those sources to ensure that they're both credible and accurate. For too long now, a lot of Appalachia has been stereotyped and whitewashed. I call it the my contemporary Anglo-Saxon ancestor phenomena. It's past time to uncover and share all of the histories associated with this area, not just those with Scots-Irish ancestry. So that being said, this history is not always pretty. Actual history is rarely so. But by uncovering these stories, bringing them to the public through events like this, the hope is to contribute to the journey towards social justice for Appalachia's disenfranchised minorities and to bring those hidden histories and those untold stories to life. So with that, we're going to get started. So some of you are probably real familiar with this image right here, this postcard. It's titled Stripes But No Stars. It depicts a small fraction of the convicts who were released by the state to the Railroad Corporation to build the Western North Carolina Railroad. It's a really popular image. It's used everywhere. Yale has an online exhibit using it. The Library of Congress has a copy. We have a copy in here in our archives at UNC Asheville in our Fred Kahn postcard collection. The appeal of the image is debatable. It evokes a period in American history that a lot of folks want to forget, a time where racial inequality and the exploitation of people of color, of minorities, were rampant. So as we go through this presentation today, the question that I want you to keep in the back of your mind is, why would we want to forget this? Who benefits if we forget our history? So the best place to start is to ask the question, how in the world did a push for a railroad make it to the frontier of North Carolina in the 1800s? So by the mid-1800s, various entrepreneurs were viewing Western North Carolina as this untouched paradise, a world-renowned source of raw materials, primarily in the form of timber and minerals. A railroad would provide a way to transport these materials to a larger economy. Up to this point, turnpikes, the well-known Buncombe Turnpike, those were the primary means of resource extraction and personal transportation. For travelers to cross the Blue Ridge Escarpment, the trip meant a daily stagecoach ride, usually driven by John Pence from Old Fort to Asheville. That took about 3 hours. To put that in perspective, if you've driven Old Fort Mountain today, I-40 West, you know it takes about 10 minutes to get from the bottom up to the top at Ridgecrest, and then about another 20 minutes to Asheville. 3 hours, 10 minutes. That's a big difference. So the North Carolina Railroad at this time connected the state from north to south, from Virginia to South Carolina. A lot of economic benefits were coming in down east. The western part of the state had been, up to this point, largely ignored by Raleigh politicians, sort of the hillbilly cousin that we don't talk about. That's me, by the way. However, by 1855, enough people were recognizing the lucrative opportunity of chartering a railroad. So the North Carolina General Assembly did just that. Construction began on tracks running from the eastern part of the state to the western North Carolina frontier. So unfortunately, for those pushing for the railroad, by 1864, travel to this area had really come to a halt. And it was because the South was deep in the Civil War. Military action had arrived in western North Carolina by June that year. General Stoneman of Stoneman's raid notoriety, he's got his own historical marker on Old Highway 70 in Ridgecrest. He had destroyed most of the area's railroads on his march to Tennessee, and that included the track that up to this point ended 5½ miles east of Morganton, which is about 30 minutes away from Old Fort. So this was the case across much of the South. Union generals were systematically demolishing most of the South's railroads. That was in an attempt to break the Confederacy's supply chain. We know what happened from this. It worked. The war eventually comes to an end. Then comes Reconstruction. So by 1868, a bond issue was passed for new construction to extend the railroad from Morganton across the Blue Ridge and into Asheville. Unfortunately, a pair of crooks enter the picture. Isn't that how it always is when you have an Appalachian historian telling a story? You got to have some crooks. So in this case, they were native North Carolinian George W. Swepson, who was a banker, New Yorker Milton S. Littlefield, who was a lobbyist. So the two of them got together. They secured control of the Western North Carolina Railroad by purchasing more than half of the issued bonds for the railroad. Then they turned around and issued fraudulent bonds to the public. So when the two men found out that they were about to be held accountable for their actions, they ended up skipping town on a train with no lights and $4 million worth of looted bonds. So as a result, the Western North Carolina Railroad was almost bankrupt and defunct before it even got off the ground. So what do you do at this point? In order to secure the continued construction of the railroad, the General Assembly agreed to purchase it and fund it with state funds. So Major James W. Wilson, a former Confederate officer, civil engineer, and a politician, is put in charge of the project. It's coined the Mountain Division. It's interesting, though, because most of the politicians who agreed to this and who were eager for this renewed push for the railroad's completion, they had no clue what lay between Old Fort and the top of the Blue Ridge Escarpment and Ridgecrest. What is that? That's about 1,100 vertical feet. So at this time, the idea was an absolute engineering feat of unmatched proportions. How do you ascend that kind of elevation in a steam locomotive to reach the top of a mountain pass? So the one thing that Wilson did understand, he knew it was going to require substantial human capital. Where are you going to find that many bodies to throw at this obstacle? I mean, think about it. We're post-Civil War at this point. Many of the area's men and boys are still gone, or they were killed during the fighting. There's no labor force in the area. The state's pretty much bankrupt during Reconstruction, so there's no money left to pay anyone. So how the devil do we find the manpower to build this? Well, there is one solution: convict labor. So the precedent for African American convict labor was established long before the first shot rang out at Fort Sumter. What was that precedent? Well, it was slavery. So by 1862, railroad promoters in the South had realized that a labor shortage was delaying construction of the railroads. That included the Western North Carolina Railroad. So William H. Thomas and Augustus S. Merriman, both from Western North Carolina, they wrote down to Governor Vance, and they said, how about sending us some enslaved people from the eastern part of the state to labor on the Western North Carolina Railroad? So initially, contracts were drawn up with enslavers to do this. However, the number of enslaved people available to work on the railroad was based on that year's agriculture. 1862 turns out to be this outstanding agricultural year in eastern North Carolina, so there's not any extra enslaved people to send to western North Carolina. However, this form of leasing had been created, so the jump to convict leasing isn't far behind. So another way to look at convict labor: study the development of the South, particularly in North Carolina. The South's economic and political systems were devastated with the end of slavery. So by creating this system of convict labor, the South was able to boost its financial viability, also simultaneously laid the groundwork for white supremacy. Well, where did all these convicts come from? So again, your post-Civil War, quite conveniently, shall we say, the General Assembly passes legislation creating the newly formed North Carolina State Penitentiary System. Well, who mostly makes up the convict population in this newly formed prison system? Former slaves. There were primarily African American freedmen. They had generally ended up in prison due to what was known as black codes and pig laws. Black codes had been passed to severely restrict the rights of formerly enslaved people. A key component of those was to use vagrancy laws. Those criminalized unemployment. So post-emancipation, as you can imagine, there was hardly any employment opportunities for former slaves across the South. So these black codes made it easy to pick up any black person in public and put them directly into prison without any sort of due process. Other discriminatory statutes were passed at the same time. They were known as pig laws. They criminalized minor offenses like petty theft. So if you went out and you stole a chicken or a loaf of bread because you had no job and your family was starving, that usually would buy you about 5 years of convict labor. So this led to a resulting surge in the South's prison population of formerly enslaved African Americans. That meant that the human capital for convict leasing exploded. For any of my data-driven folks out there, in the 1880 National Census, only 38% of North Carolina's population was African American, but 85% of its state penitentiary population is African American. So by 1872, the General Assembly had authorized the penitentiary to farm out all prisoners not needed for penitentiary construction for the best terms obtainable. By 1874, the prison system, they're really struggling financially. They need food, they need clothing, they need housing for inmates. So the legislature passed a bill that gave the penitentiary board the legal means to enter into lease contracts for convicts. The act meant that every convict over the number 250 would be farmed out for food and clothing, or even less than food and clothing if necessary, to any entity investing in the state economy and assisting in lessening the burden on overcrowded, non-existent penitentiary facilities. Section 12 of that act specifically provides for employing as many convicts as necessary on the Western North Carolina Railroad. So again, most of these convicts, they're African American men and boys. They'd been in prison for crimes that were often related to poverty, the lack of employment opportunities. A few of the convicts were women and girls. They were from all over the state of North Carolina, though the majority were from eastern North Carolina from the state penitentiary system. They were sent to work to the Western North Carolina Railroad. They were supposed to work 10 hours daily, except on Sundays and national holidays. At any given time, the number of convicts working on the railroad was supposed to number 500. They were supposed to be supplied with food and clothing. Food reports often suggested standard fare at this time was navy beans and cornbread. The railroad spent between 6 and 10 cents per day on each convict's food rations. So total maintenance costs for convicts amounted to about 30 cents per day, or what would amount to about $9 today. That sum is entirely inadequate to supply even basic subsistence needs. So disease and death were quite the norm for convict laborers. The convict labor system today is known as having carried forward the worst aspects of slavery. So getting back to the railroad here, Major Wilson, the engineer for the Western North Carolina Railroad, he writes to the governor of North Carolina, Zeb Vance. He's writing to him regularly during this time. Vance is from Western North Carolina. He believes that the railroad extension to Asheville is going to bring economic benefits to the area, including increasing the value of his own properties that he holds there. Wilson complained to Vance about the number of convict leases he was getting that was granted to work on the railroad. He wanted Vance to force the penitentiary board to send more convicts his way. Vance agreed with Wilson. He was a proponent of convict leasing. So to accommodate Wilson, he specifically directs several superior court judges across the state to sentence convicts to serve their terms directly on the Western North Carolina Railroad, bypassing due process, bypassing the state penitentiary. I'm aware, especially for those of you who are historians out there, this is a damning accusation. The historical and the archival records unambiguously support it, though. So today, the fact that Vance did this raises a lot of questions regarding ethics, due process, the state's view of equality post the 13th Amendment. I'm not going to leave you hanging on this either. Hang on to this. We're going to come back to it. So again, today, convict leasing is essentially called slavery by another name. Why? Well, let's talk about the conditions for convict laborers on the Western North Carolina Railroad. Workers were kept in various camps between Henry Station, which is just to the west of Old Fort, and Swannanoa. Building the tunnels by hand proves extremely dangerous. Since the end of the Civil War, black powder was really scarce in the South. So, to solve the problem of excavating solid granite, workers had to cut down vast piles of pine logs by hand. They had to stack them. They burnt them down to hot coals. They would then pour cold water on top of the rocks, and that sudden contraction split the rock for tunnel construction. Nitroglycerin was also used at this time. They would mix it with sawdust and cornmeal. They would tamp it down into a drill hole. These workers had no training to handle any of these types of explosives, so many were either severely maimed or they died, and they were buried in countless unmarked graves right alongside the track. By late 1877, almost all convict laborers at the Western North Carolina Railroad site were being transported in from the eastern part of the state. The geography, the climate, the unvaried diet in Western North Carolina at the time, it made disease and death a daily part of camp. Convict camps were actually called stockades. Prisoners were frequently housed temporarily in train cars. They were usually chained to the inside walls. Those were hot, cramped in the summer. They were freezing and damp in the winter. Workers were often required to work shackled to one another on chain gangs. The state also permitted guards and overseers to use whips to beat workers. Conditions were very, very similar to what enslaved people had endured just a decade or so previously. There were some scattered newspaper reports of workers escaping. Most of them were shot on sight as they attempted it. This is the stockade near the Swannanoa Tunnel. It was one of the largest convict camps that was constructed on the Western North Carolina Railroad. The tunnel inspired a folk song of the same name called Asheville Junction. It was composed by incarcerated workers. It was sung as a hammer song while they worked. Hammer songs helped provide this steady rhythm to work by. Lyrics often spoke of working conditions, struggles, strength, resistance. Swannanoa Tunnel's lyrics specifically speak of danger and severe conditions that often led to death. Probably one of the most authentic recordings of this song. There's a lot of recordings. Bascom Lamar Lunsford all the way to Rhiannon Giddens. But probably the most authentic was done by Will Shorty Love for Duke University folklorist Frank Brown in 1939. Love, who was an African-American employee at Duke at the time, he sang the song unaccompanied while pounding a table to mimic hammer strikes. I have a link to that actual clip. I'll put that in the chat at the end of this. So let's get back to talking about what it was going to take to get the railroad track up the Blue Ridge Escarpment. So remember I said that was 1,100 vertical feet straight up. So building this section of railroad, it was absolutely uncharted territory for any railroad company. So Wilson had to come up with something innovative, something that had never been done before. So he came up with the idea of a twisting, curving track that ascended the mountain and which looped back on itself to achieve the required grade of about 2 feet per 100 feet. So that meant that around 786 vertical feet were overcome in about 7.5 miles. The track's total curvature was about 2,700 degrees or 8 complete circles in order to negotiate the mountain's gradient. It was also necessary to cut 6 tunnels. The Swannanoa was the longest at 1,832 feet. Then you had Licklog, High Ridge, Bergen, Jarrett's, and McElroy was the smallest at around 77 feet. So to put all of these numbers in perspective, because I realize I just threw a bunch of numbers at you, the actual point-to-point distance up the escarpment is only about 3 miles, but the railroad track is over double that distance. So progress on this was really difficult. Wilson blamed a lack of workers as the primary reason. The legislature actually directed an investigation in 1879. This was prompted by allegations of mismanagement. But the engineers' report found that most delays and difficulties were actually due to landslides. One tunnel had even caved in during a landslide. It wiped out all signs of human labor at the spot. In another cut, it took almost a year to find a passable solution because nearly 77,000 cubic yards of dirt and rock had been removed by hand by the workers. But then landslides deposited over 110,000 cubic yards of debris back into the cut, and that cut's called mud cut. By far, though, the biggest obstacle to completing the railroad, Swannanoa Tunnel. It proved particularly daunting. Wilson had to bore from both sides of the gap simultaneously. Remember, I said the tunnel was about 1,800 feet long. That's like 6 football fields. So to help with this last obstacle, he brings in the 17-ton Norris-built 440 locomotive, the Salisbury, to haul supplies and laborers to the site. So the question is now, how do you get it up to the top of the gap to help build the Swannanoa Tunnel? Well, it was hauled up by 10 oxen and a crew of almost 300 African-American convict laborers. They were hitched to it like mules, and they were driven with whips. Section of track would be laid. The Salisbury would be advanced by hand on the newly laid track. Previously passed sections were then pulled up and relayed at the front end of the locomotive. On the other side of the gap, the train was slid down on a skid. So the two crews working on each side of the tunnel met on March 11th, 1879. Newspapers across the country wrote of the event. Daylight entered Buncombe County today through the Swannanoa Tunnel. That's the phrase that was regularly repeated. What was not written about until years later was the cave-in that same day at the western portal of the tunnel. That killed 20 workers and a guard. The consensus was, though, it was the completion of the railroad that was important, not the means. So the railroad was completed. It brought tremendous change to the area. It was later sold primarily due to the remaining cost of extending it to the far western part of the state. The use of convict labor continued, though, even after a new railroad president, Colonel Alexander B. Andrews, was elected. Like Wilson, he reported various delays due to an insufficient number of convicts, rugged terrain, poor weather conditions as the laborers worked their way towards the western part of the state. The railroad reaches Murphy in 1891. It passes through the towns of Bryson City and Andrews. It also goes up and over Balsam Gap. That became the highest railroad pass east of the Rocky Mountains. So Colonel Andrews goes on to partner with Wilson in 1885. They build Round Knob Hotel, which is a hotel and restaurant on the Western North Carolina Railroad line just to the west of Old Fort. It becomes a success. It features a fountain monument that's later dedicated to Andrews. It becomes synonymous with the railroad. It burned down in 1903. It was rebuilt in the 1930s as the Round Knob Lodge by Southern Railroad as an executive retreat. Still there today, what's left of it. It's a private residence now. The geyser's still there. The geyser's managed by the town. So today, this section of railway is maintained by Norfolk Southern Railway. It's considered a landmark gateway between Old Fort and Asheville. There's a renovated depot in downtown Old Fort, which sits directly beside the tracks. Helene, like the hurricanes that hit in 1916, destroyed much of the track on the Mountain Division. But Norfolk Southern has committed to rebuilding. They're relaying the track up the mountain even as we speak today. There's also a renewed push to eventually bring passenger rail service to the line. Amtrak wants to have it operational by 2034. So until a few years ago, the name most associated with this section of railroad, Colonel Andrews. He's often featured as the key player in the building of the Mountain Division. That changed in 2020, though. So UNC Asheville history professor at the time, Dr. Daniel Pierce, and Marion's mayor, Steve Little, got together on Dan's front porch during COVID, and they decided to organize the nonprofit organization, the Rail Project, to honor the incarcerated laborers who endured the brutal conditions it took to build the railroad over the Blue Ridge Escarpment. So, board members comprised a mix of backgrounds. We had historians, archivists, we even had a local stonemason. At this point, we've placed 3 different memorials to the workers. The first at the Andrews Geyser site near Round Knob. The second is a wayside panel at the head of Old 70 just over the Swannanoa Tunnel. And the third is at a presumed stockade in Ridgecrest. To add the information, to add the worker names that we could find up to this point, we spent countless hours scouring newspapers.com, ancestry.com, the census. We searched for terms such as convict and WNC railroad. So here's the part you guys came to hear. This is where the story really begins. So in 2023, one of my colleagues from Warren Wilson College, Dr. Jeff Keith, he was at the state archives researching the Swannanoa Tunnel song. The archivist hands him some folders out of a box, but she won't give him the box to look through. It's a restricted box. So Jeff's like, what's in the box that I can't see? Well, it turns out that they were the records of the laborers who worked directly on the railroad. So Jeff reaches out to Dr. Darren Waters. He was another rail board member. He's now the deputy secretary for the Office of Archives and History. He's a former history professor at UNC Asheville. So Darren contacts the state archivist at the time, Sarah Kuntz, and her team, and he says, hey, I've got a colleague who wants to see these restricted prison records from the Western North Carolina Railroad. How do we get these open? So Sarah tells Darren, Jeff, and Dan, you need to reach out to your local representative, John Ager. So John includes a bill in a larger omnibus bill that's presented to the state legislature to release those records, and it passes. It's unclear how many legislators actually read that part of the bill, but it passes. I'm going to get to the Atlanta History Center here in a minute because that's the second part here. So hold on to your horses. We're getting there. So these records at the state archives, they include individual names, individual information, first and last name, ages, race, where they were from, what they had been convicted for, how many years they served, when they were sent to the Western North Carolina Railroad, how they died. They'd never been seen before. When these records were opened, Dr. Keith and his colleague, and then myself, we were the first people to see them. So another of my colleagues in Raleigh, I'm going to try not to butcher her name here. Her name's Kayla Kolklisher. She's an anthropology PhD candidate. She was there the day after me. We ran into each other down there. She came to access the records too. She has created this fantastic site for the state archives. It shows some of these items. Her specific focus is on the laborers' resistance during their incarceration. So anyway, the day I was there, I looked through over 1,000 pages of penitentiary board notes. These notes were describing working conditions, penitentiary conditions, day-to-day supervision of convicts. I mean, it was absolutely mind-blowing. Every 2 minutes, I was either texting Dan Pierce or my husband just like furiously typing, you're never going to believe what I just found. I've got hundreds of scans, so many, I'm still going through them. And then there's another kicker. There's more information there that wasn't shared with me when I went on that first visit. They've continued to find additional materials. So as you can guess, I'm certainly going back to Raleigh at some point soon. So at the same time that all of this is going on, I'd also found out that the Atlanta History Center was opening this incredible collection to the public. So in 2021, Norfolk Southern Railway donated their entire archival holdings of their predecessor, Southern Railway. Southern Railway was the one that helped charter and oversee the construction of the Mountain Division of the Western North Carolina Railroad. That was who Wilson represented. So the records there at the Atlanta History Center span from 1828 to 2007. They were cataloged or processed, as we archivists call it, over 2.5 years. Then they were open for research at the beginning of 2024. So one weekend that summer, I was about an hour north of Atlanta with my husband and my 4-year-old daughter. We were visiting his parents, doing some grandparent time, and I thought, I'm going to take the day, go down, take a look at these records, Probably nothing there, but I'm going to go see what I can find. I was absolutely floored all over again. I quickly realized that this was the side of the story from Wilson and the Railroad Board. So many of these documents cross-referenced and matched up with the State Penitentiary Board documents. I will put this in as an aside. This whole project is just demanding some kind of digital humanities mapping component. I've got so much on my plate right now, I can't even begin to entertain that thought, but that I'm going to throw that out there. So these records included labor conditions, weather, geographical issues, costs, purchases, notes regarding Wilson's letters to Vance requesting more convicts to complete the line. One of the more interesting documents I found was the Railroad Board's report and Wilson's petition to put the convicts and the state penitentiary sent overseers under strict military law because Wilson didn't feel like they were working with enough discipline and urgency. So the response back from the penitentiary board was downright facetious. They told the railroad board, if you want a military, you better get yourself, quote, a spirit stirring drum and drummer, an ear piercing pipe and piper for each of the quarters, Round Knob, Long Branch, and Lick Log. So they were basically telling Wilson, we will have money for something like that. Stop bothering us. Send us our convict lease fees and zip it. So make no mistake, though, these records are not just about the story between the state penitentiary and the railroad board, although that's a huge facet of it, too. These new archival records, though, they illustrate that without the disenfranchised black bodies that built this railroad, the progress that came to Western North Carolina in the form of timber profits, the healthcare boom, the economic benefits derived from regional tourism, none of that would have been possible. So combined with what we found on newspapers.com, these records bring to light a state government that was willing to pass legislation explicitly directing Superior Court judges across the state to send African Americans directly to the Western North Carolina Railroad on exaggerated charges with overdone sentences, bypassing the penitentiary and effectively sentencing them to a likely death. This was all in the name of economic progress and the political machinations of Western North Carolina elites who directly aided the state in transforming what was previously slave labor into a legal form of slave labor known as convict leasing. These records, which were not open to the public for well over a century, they illustrate that the state of North Carolina was unequivocally complicit in supplying the Western North Carolina Railroad with African Americans who were almost always improperly incarcerated. Equally damning, supporting this cyclical arrangement with Wilson was none other than Western North Carolina's own Zebulon B. Vance, who also happened to be the governor of North Carolina at the time. So what does this all mean? So academically for me, it's essentially my primary area of research. I've got several pieces I'm working on for publications. One's almost ready for the North Carolina Historical Review. I've got some presentations coming up at some national conferences. Personally, it means a lot more to me. I mentioned I'm the granddaughter of a man who worked for Norfolk Southern, who was also a member of several unions, including the United Transportation Union. This was also the same man whose great-grandmother was a formerly enslaved African American married to a white man 4 decades her senior, and who lived here in Western North Carolina on a working tobacco farm of more than 600 acres. They were known as the Black Anderson clan. There's a lot more to that story. Still trying to unpack it. Suffice it to say, in the interest of time, it's a very complicated history for me. The big picture remains the same, though. This material has to be shared. I've highlighted several of my colleagues' works on this material in this presentation because it needs to be disseminated. The image on this slide is the website my Raleigh colleague put together for the state archives. Your next question is, why do I think this information needs to be widely shared? I'm going to tell you. Because so many people just don't know their own history. And for those who live here in Western North Carolina, that holds true as well. They don't know how this place came to be the tourist playground, the farm to table international cuisine, the eclectic art scene, the outdoor mecca. It is because of this incredible infrastructure project, the Mountain Division of the Western North Carolina Railroad. And make no mistake, it would not have been possible without the human capital behind it. And that human cost is the most important part and what needs to be remembered. That would not have been possible without the opening of these archival records. So for me, both as a historian and an archivist, this comes down to equity. So many of our libraries, our archives, our historical centers, they're white, they're male centered. As a historian, it's my job to locate, to verify, to share facts. As an archivist, I have to ensure that systemic biases in collection development, archival description, and access issues are addressed. So, what does that mean? It means continuing to do work like this, where diverse voices are uncovered and shared, and where all perspectives in the historical record are written about, and continuing to advocate for those who don't have a voice for whatever the reason. Just like these men who worked on the railroad and who are gone now, left no personal record other than what we've managed to start piecing together from penitentiary and railroad records. We have to replace the biased narrative with the objective truth. As an archivist, as a historian, it's my responsibility to ensure that everyone has a voice, that everyone has a seat at the table. So I can do my part in helping create a society that is representative of all of us, pass along a history to our children, our grandchildren, to my daughter that reflects everyone's story. So, on that note, thanks for making it through to the end with me here. Thanks for listening to me get excited about my work. Every time I do this presentation, I just get so re-fired up. Yes, this is my grandfather. This is on the caboose of a Norfolk Southern train. This is around Clinchfield near Marion, probably late 70s, early 80s. I might have just been born. Could have been a few years before I was born. Feels like a long, long time ago. Anyway, I'm happy to take questions, comments, if Rachel says that we have time. I am going to put the link to Will Shorty Love's rendition of Asheville Junction in the chat as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. We do have time for questions. I wanted to make sure that we had quite a bit of time at the end of your presentation. So we have the session booked till 12 if we have a lot of great discussion and questions. So everybody feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute yourself. Yeah.
Rachel, thanks for letting me do this again.
Absolutely.
I get to the last part there about the archives and everything and what we found and stuff, and I just get so reinvigorated and so fired up again about it. And I love giving this presentation. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I love hearing it. This was, like I said, this was number 2 for me, and I learned more this time around. So just keep coming back.
Maybe I answered everything in the presentation.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm Denise Jones, and I'm suffering from a bad cold, and I'm home today. But I work at the state library. A few years ago, I did research on an African American gentleman in Greensboro that he was convicted. He murdered his wife. Not that maybe she didn't have it coming, but anyway, he was assigned to a chain gang, and I tried to follow the whole story through. But once he was assigned to a chain gang, I want to say probably 1915 or something, but in the Dismal Swamp, sort of a similar um, cheap labor.
Mhm.
But I could never find what happened to him. I went through census records, and it was the beginnings, just about the time they started keeping death certificates. So they were really not concerned with death certificates of African Americans or people on chain gangs. So um, not really a question, other than, it sort of continued on into the following century about the not really caring about convicts, or the pretty much what amounted to slave labor for people that had been convicted.
Yeah, there's a couple of great books out there that I reference in this paper and papers that I'm working on. One's called Slavery by Another Name, and one is called One Dies, Get Another, and it's talking about convict leasing in the South. Both of those books, at the gist of them, are exactly what you were saying, is that this system has carried through and continued on even up until today. Absolutely.
Yeah, it seemed like it was a death sentence to go onto those chain gangs. So I really enjoyed your presentation today. And like I said, it followed through into the following century, I'm afraid.
I agree, and thank you so much.
All right, we have a question in the chat. Have you looked at newspaper records from outside of the state? Was there any social commentary from outside the state of North Carolina on the use of prison labor to build the railroad?
Absolutely. One of the newspapers that I kept coming up with in regards to this was a newspaper out of Georgia, and I'd have to go back into my notes and my citations to get the exact name of that paper. But there were a lot of folks down there, especially women, who were pushing social reform at the time, and they were talking about this railroad labor and this convict labor that was building these railroads. And there was some quite fascinating articles about people just that they were just giving these railroad companies down the road, and the state as well, for supporting them. And this was surprising to me, because this was, I mean, you're talking deep South. Georgia's one of the primary slave states, right during the Civil War, right before the Civil War. And there is a lot of social reformers down there who are just damning the whole system. So that was really interesting to me, to find newspaper articles coming out of Georgia about that. Hey, there's my other boss on here who just unmuted.
And raised her hand. Ashley, I'm so proud of you. I didn't get to hear the whole thing. I had a student meeting and I missed the first half hour. But I think you mentioned something about perhaps some digital humanities projects and mapping projects. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about your plans here, and then, over a beer later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The digital mapping project, I don't think I have the bandwidth to undertake right now. That may be something that I undertake in the future, or it could be something that someone else undertakes, because the information is out there. It's public now. Anybody can go and get it. I have all these scans from newspapers.com. I have all the scans from the state archives. I have the scans from the Atlanta History Center. And as far as the digital mapping goes, I'm thinking the scans from the state archives, and that was from the state penitentiary system. A lot of those cross-reference or match up, kind of like they were writing back and forth with what has come out of the Atlanta History Center from Southern Railway and the Mountain Division. So I could see this great website where you click on one thing from the state archives and then it goes to other things that are related from the Atlanta History Center and vice versa. I mean, it absolutely begs for a digital mapping project.
We can talk about it. Maybe the digital history class could take on a little piece of it. So
Oh,
yeah.
I think it'd be great.
But this is, that's such an effective way of making this bit of history even more accessible to a broader number of people. So
Yeah,
you have done amazing work, and I look forward to hearing more about what you do from here.
I'm ready for that beer.
Me too, but not right now. Yeah.
Yeah, not right
Uh,
now.
All right, we have another question in the chat. Some of the images you used in this excellent presentation are ones I've never seen before. You've got them cited as from the Citizen Times. Are they from the recent Gannett archives that were donated? Are there more images relating to this topic in your collections that will be coming to light? Is there a way to access them?
So what is in the presentation, the ones from the Asheville Citizen Times, you can find those on newspapers.com. They're not something that's not already been out there. Those have been out there. They're easily found. Um, I have found a box. Another box. I found a box in here in the recently donated archives from the railroad. Sadly, I have not found anything that goes this far back. A lot of the images, specifically, especially right here on this slide right here, specifically that are related to the mountain division, a lot of them you will find in private collections. This is a particular one right here, the Gerald Ledford collection. Mr. Ledford actually lives down around Highlands Cashers, I believe. And you know, these old railroad guys, they're funny. So they have these documents and these images and these pictures, of this time and of other times, related to the railroad. But they're real tight with them. You really have to be in the good old boys club to get in and see some of these images and documents. And so far I haven't had any luck in cracking Mr. Ledford's shell. But I'll keep on with that. And like I said, most of what you see in this presentation right here, they're found online. All you have to do is look them up online. You can find them on newspapers.com. Several of them are pulled from my colleague's collection at Buncombe County Special Collections. This particular image of the Swannanoa Stockade, this is a great image pulled from their collection. They have a ton of images of the Mountain Division there in their special collections. So, no, I mean, most of these are easily accessible, easily found online or in local archives. The few images that have not come to light yet are probably sitting in some old railroad guy's personal collection that he's not given up the ghost yet. Oh, and feel free to email me if there's a particular image that you have an interest in. I'm happy to share with you, and I will put my email in the chat too, so folks will have it.
All right, so any final questions before we wrap up? Thank you guys for asking your awesome questions. It's been great to get those questions and learn more about what Ashley's been doing. And just thank you again, Ashley, for taking the time to talk with us and share all this amazing research you've been doing.
Thanks for letting me. I love talking about it. Obviously, I'm a Appalachian storyteller at heart, so I love talking about it.
I don't know if you can see them, but you're getting lots of hearts and claps. So
I see it.
Very good.
Thank y'all so much for listening.
All right, there will be a recording of this presentation that will be made available. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you all again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
Thank y'all.